The crumpled court summons fell from Maria Castellanos' trembling fingers onto the grease-stained floor of Mel's 24-hour diner. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with their usual electric hum, casting harsh shadows across her exhausted face as she bent to retrieve the papers that would change everything. Her black polyester uniform clung to her thin frame, the smell of bacon grease and coffee permanently embedded in the fabric after another 12-hour shift that barely covered her rent. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden fortunes and devastating revenge, I'm curious about where you're watching from today. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're in, because this tale of financial deception could happen anywhere, and I'd love to know where my audience is tuning in from around the world. Maria's hands shook as she read the legal documents for the third time, each word cutting deeper than the last. Thomas Whitmore, her ex-husband of 6 months, was demanding monthly alimony payments of $2,000. $2,000 from a woman who counted quarters for bus fare and bought day-old bread from the discount rack. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't destroying her life piece by piece. 3 years ago, everything had been different. Maria remembered the corner office at Hartwell Financial, the view of downtown Seattle spreading out below her mahogany desk, the respect in her colleagues' voices when she walked into board meetings. She had been the youngest senior analyst in the company's history, pulling down 6 figures while managing portfolios worth millions. Her grandmother Elena's voice echoed in her memory, speaking in accented English about pride and independence, about never depending on a man for anything. But then Thomas had entered her life like a hurricane wrapped in expensive cologne and perfectly tailored suits. Thomas Whitmore had been everything she thought she wanted: Harvard law degree, partnership track at Preston & Associates, and a smile that could convince juries and apparently financial analysts to abandon everything they had worked for. He had courted her with roses and weekend trips to Napa Valley, whispering about how successful couples supported each other's dreams. When he suggested she leave Hartwell Financial to focus on their relationship and future family, it had sounded romantic. When he insisted on managing their finances because he understood legal and tax implications better, it had seemed practical. When he convinced her to liquidate her modest investment portfolio and savings account to help fund his private practice, it had felt like love. The courthouse loomed before her now like a gray concrete monument to broken promises. Maria clutched the summons in one hand and her worn purse in the other, its contents consisting of $37, a chapstick, and a photograph of her grandmother Elena that she carried everywhere. The woman in the photograph had owned 3 apartment buildings in her native Colombia before immigrating to America with nothing but determination and a suitcase. Elena Castellanos had built a new life through sheer will and careful investments, always telling Maria that blood would tell when the time was right, whatever that meant. Inside the courthouse, the marble floors echoed with the clicking of expensive heels and the shuffle of desperate feet. Maria spotted Thomas immediately, his 6-foot frame impeccable in a navy Armani suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his confident posture radiated the success that he had systematically stripped from her during their marriage. Beside him stood Margaret Chun, a divorce attorney known for ruthlessly representing wealthy husbands who wanted to keep their fortunes intact. Maria's own legal representation consisted of David Rodriguez, an overworked public defender who had been assigned her case that morning. His rumpled suit and coffee-stained tie spoke volumes about the disparity between their legal teams. He carried a cardboard box stuffed with case files and apologized profusely for having only 15 minutes to review her situation before the hearing. The bailiff called their case, and Maria felt her legs turn to water as they approached the bench. Judge Patricia Morrison presided with silver hair pulled back severely and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for impatience with poorly prepared arguments. Margaret Chun rose first, her Louboutin heels clicking against the floor with each measured step. She was everything Maria used to be: confident, well-dressed, commanding respect in a male-dominated field. Her opening statement painted Thomas as a devoted husband who had sacrificed his own career advancement to support Maria's alleged emotional instability and subsequent unemployment. According to Chin's carefully crafted narrative, Thomas had been forced to take on additional clients and work excessive hours to compensate for Maria's inability to maintain steady employment after leaving Hartwell Financial. She presented documentation showing Maria's current income from 2 part-time jobs, the overnight shift at Mel's Diner and weekend cleaning services for a janitorial company. The numbers were pathetic, barely totaling $1,500 per month before taxes. Thomas took the witness stand with practiced ease, his voice carrying the trained modulation of a successful attorney. He testified about their marriage with the same tone he might use to argue a corporate merger, clinical and precise. He described coming home to find Maria in bed at 3 in the afternoon, unable to motivate herself to seek appropriate employment. He spoke of encouraging her to pursue therapy and career counseling, painting himself as a patient husband dealing with a wife's depression and lack of ambition. The performance was masterful and utterly false, but Maria watched Judge Morrison taking notes and nodding sympathetically. Thomas explained how he had supported them both during the final 2 years of their marriage, covering their mortgage, her medical expenses, and all household costs while she contributed nothing financially to their partnership. The request for alimony was presented as simple fairness, a temporary measure to help him recover from the financial burden of carrying them both. Maria's chest tightened as she listened to this revision of their history. There was no mention of how he had isolated her from former colleagues, claiming they were jealous of her happiness. No discussion of how he had gradually taken control of every financial decision, insisting she was too emotional to handle money matters properly. The nights when she had suggested returning to work were rewritten as Thomas encouraging her to pursue employment while she made excuses and avoided responsibility. When David Rodriguez finally had a chance to present Maria's side, his nervousness was palpable. He stumbled through questions about her employment history and current financial situation, clearly unprepared for the complexity of the case. His best argument was that Maria could barely support herself, let alone make payments to someone who earned significantly more than she did. It was true but inadequate against Chen's polished presentation. During a brief recess, Rodriguez pulled Maria aside in the hallway, his expression grim. He mentioned that her case had some unusual elements that required investigation, something about family matters that hadn't been properly documented during the divorce proceedings. Maria stared at him blankly, having no idea what family matters he could possibly mean. Her parents had died when she was 12, and her grandmother Elena had passed away 2 years before she met Thomas. There was no family money, no hidden assets, nothing but the small inheritance from Elena's life insurance that Thomas had convinced her to invest in his practice. As they returned to the courtroom, Maria noticed a well-dressed woman in the gallery taking notes during the proceedings. She had steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, occasionally glancing between Thomas and a thick folder on her lap. When their eyes met briefly, the woman nodded almost imperceptibly before returning her attention to her papers. Judge Morrison announced that she would review all financial documentation before making her decision, setting another hearing date for the following week. As they filed out of the courtroom, Thomas approached Maria with his signature smile, the same one that had convinced her to trust him with her life. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, and spoke in a voice loud enough for others to hear. He told her that he hoped there would be no hard feelings about the alimony request, that he was simply trying to recover from the financial hardship her dependents had caused. He suggested that perhaps this would motivate her to develop better work habits and finally take responsibility for her own life. The words hit Maria like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to maximize humiliation. Around them, other people involved in divorce proceedings watched with mixture of sympathy and judgment. Thomas had managed to make her poverty look like laziness, her struggle like a character flaw that deserved punishment rather than support. As Thomas walked away with Margaret Shun, discussing dinner plans at an expensive downtown restaurant, Maria stood frozen in the courthouse hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead just like at the diner, but here they illuminated marble floors instead of cracked linoleum. The contrast felt like a mockery of everything she had lost and everything she could never get back. David Rodriguez touched her shoulder gently, promising to investigate those family matters he had mentioned. His voice carried a note of hope that Maria couldn't quite understand, as if he knew something she didn't about her own life. But all Maria could think about was her grandmother Elena's final words before the cancer took her, spoken in Spanish with fierce intensity. "Blood will tell, Mija. When the time comes, blood will tell." Maria had never understood what Elena meant, but something about Rodriguez's mysterious investigation made those words echo in her mind as she walked out into the Seattle rain. The following Tuesday arrived with the kind of relentless Seattle drizzle that seemed designed to match Maria's mood as she climbed the courthouse steps once again. Her only professional outfit, a navy blue dress she had bought for job interviews, hung loose on her diminished frame. The weight loss hadn't been intentional, more a side effect of choosing between groceries and bus fare too many times over the past 6 months. She clutched the same worn purse, this time containing $23 and a packet of saltine crackers she had taken from the diner for lunch. David Rodriguez met her in the hallway, looking marginally more prepared than the previous week. His suit was pressed, his coffee stain replaced by a fresh tie, and he carried a proper briefcase instead of the cardboard box. More importantly, his expression held something that hadn't been there before. Determination mixed with barely contained excitement about something he couldn't quite explain yet. He told her that his investigation into her family matters had uncovered some interesting inconsistencies that required further review. When Maria pressed him for details, he promised to explain everything after the hearing, saying only that certain financial records didn't match the timeline Thomas had provided during their divorce proceedings. His cryptic words echoed her grandmother Elena's mysterious final message about blood-telling, but Maria pushed the thought away as wishful thinking born from desperation. Margaret Chin's second performance was even more devastating than her opening act. She had spent the week gathering what she called evidence of Maria's pattern of financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation during the marriage. The documentation she presented painted a picture so twisted from reality that Maria barely recognized herself in the narrative. Chin displayed bank statements showing Maria's direct deposits stopping abruptly when she left Hartwell Financial, followed by months of zero income, while Thomas's earnings supported their household entirely. What the statements didn't show was the context. Thomas had convinced her that his legal practice needed her full attention to help with client management and business development. He had promised that her temporary sacrifice would benefit them both when his firm expanded and became more profitable. The attorney presented emails Maria had sent to Thomas during their marriage, messages taken completely out of context to support Chin's narrative of dependency and manipulation. One email thanking Thomas for handling a mortgage payment became evidence of Maria's expectation that he would always take care of her financially. Another message expressing gratitude for his patience during a difficult week was presented as proof of her emotional instability and inability to handle adult responsibilities. Chin's most damaging evidence was a series of financial documents that Maria herself had signed during their marriage. The papers showed her authorization for Thomas to manage their joint investment accounts, handle tax filings, and make financial decisions on her behalf. What looked like reasonable arrangements between married partners was presented as evidence of Maria's unwillingness to take responsibility for her own financial welfare. The most devastating revelation came when Chun presented documentation of Maria's inheritance from her grandmother Elena. The papers showed that Maria had received $47,000 from Elena's life insurance policy, money that had been liquidated and transferred to Thomas's business account with Maria's signed authorization. Chin explained that despite receiving this substantial inheritance, Maria had continued to depend on Thomas for all living expenses, essentially treating him as her personal bank while contributing nothing to their household. Maria's face burned with shame as the judge reviewed the documents. The inheritance money had been her grandmother's final gift, intended to provide security and independence. Thomas had convinced her that investing it in his legal practice would multiply their wealth while supporting his career advancement. He had made it sound like a partnership, a way for her money to work harder for their future together. Now it looked like she had simply handed over her inheritance and then lived as a dependent for 2 years. Thomas took the witness stand with even greater confidence than the previous week, clearly energized by Chin's masterful presentation. His testimony was a carefully crafted masterpiece of manipulation disguised as reluctant honesty. He spoke with the pained expression of a man forced to reveal embarrassing truths about someone he had once loved. He testified that Maria's departure from Hartwell Financial had been her decision, made against his advice and encouragement to maintain her career. According to his version of events, she had become increasingly dissatisfied with corporate life and convinced herself that she wanted to focus on their relationship instead of professional responsibilities. He claimed to have encouraged her to seek other employment when she grew bored with staying home, but she had consistently made excuses and avoided job interviews. Thomas's voice carried just the right note of sadness as he described coming home from 14-hour days at the office to find Maria still in pajamas, having accomplished nothing productive during his absence. He painted a picture of a woman who had lost her professional drive and motivation, preferring to live comfortably on his earnings rather than rebuild her own career. His testimony made her sound lazy, entitled, and completely disconnected from financial reality. The most painful part of his testimony focused on the inheritance money from Elena. Thomas explained that Maria had been devastated by her grandmother's death and wanted to do something meaningful with the insurance money. Investing it in his legal practice had been her idea, he claimed, a way to honor Elena's memory by building something lasting together. He presented himself as reluctant to accept the money, concerned about mixing personal and business finances, but ultimately agreeing because Maria had been so emotionally invested in the concept. According to Thomas's testimony, the investment had been profitable, contributing to his practice's growth and success. However, Maria had continued to expect him to support her lifestyle completely, never acknowledging that her own money was generating returns that benefited them both. He characterized their financial arrangement as fundamentally unfair, with him carrying all responsibility while she enjoyed all benefits without any accountability. Judge Morrison asked Thomas about his current income and expenses, and his answers revealed the comfortable lifestyle he maintained. His law practice generated approximately $12,000 monthly in take-home income after business expenses and taxes. His current living expenses, including his downtown condominium mortgage, car payments for his BMW, and other necessities, totaled roughly $8,000 per month. According to his calculations, he had been spending an additional $2,000 monthly supporting Maria during the final years of their marriage. When it came time for Maria to testify, David Rodriguez guided her through questions designed to present her side of the story. But against Chin's polished presentation and Thomas's confident lies, Maria's truth sounded weak and defensive. She tried to explain how Thomas had gradually taken control of their finances, making her feel incompetent and emotionally unstable whenever she questioned his decisions. Her words sounded like excuses rather than explanations. Maria detailed her current living situation with humiliating precision. She shared a studio apartment with a woman named Rosa, sleeping on an air mattress in the corner while Rosa occupied the single bed. The apartment cost $900 monthly, split between them, leaving Maria responsible for $450 plus half the utilities. Her income from the diner averaged $600 per month after taxes, supplemented by another $400 from weekend cleaning work. After rent, utilities, and bus fare, she had approximately $300 monthly for food, clothing, and all other necessities. She described shopping at discount grocery stores, buying marked-down vegetables and day-old bread, stretching every meal as far as possible. She talked about wearing the same 3 outfits to work, washing them by hand in the apartment's tiny sink because laundromats were too expensive. The details painted a picture of poverty so stark that even Margaret Chin seemed uncomfortable during Maria's testimony. When Rodriguez asked about the inheritance money, Maria's voice broke slightly as she explained how much Elena's gift had meant to her. The $47,000 had represented her grandmother's life savings, money Elena had carefully accumulated while working as a seamstress and cleaning houses to support her family. Elena had always emphasized the importance of financial independence, teaching Maria to save money and make careful investments for the future. Maria testified that Thomas had presented the investment opportunity as a way to honor Elena's values while building their future together. He had shown her business plans and profit projections, explaining how her money would generate better returns through his legal practice than through traditional investments. She had trusted his expertise and believed they were building something together that would benefit them both for decades to come. Judge Morrison asked Maria directly why she hadn't sought employment sooner after leaving Hartwell Financial. Maria's answer revealed more about Thomas's psychological manipulation than she perhaps realized. She explained that she had tried to apply for positions similar to her previous role, but Thomas had convinced her that she was emotionally fragile and needed time to heal from her career burnout. He had suggested that rushing back into a high-stress environment would be harmful to her mental health and their relationship. When she had finally insisted on returning to work after 18 months, Thomas had discouraged her from contacting former colleagues, claiming they had expressed concern about her stability during her absence. He had instead encouraged her to consider less demanding positions that wouldn't interfere with their home life. Every suggestion she made was met with gentle discouragement disguised as concern for her well-being. During cross-examination, Margaret Chin systematically destroyed Maria's credibility with surgical precision. She pointed out that Maria was an intelligent, educated woman who had once managed million-dollar portfolios, yet claimed to have been manipulated by standard financial discussions between spouses. Chin suggested that Maria's current poverty was the natural consequence of choosing leisure over responsibility, and that her ex-husband shouldn't be punished for her poor decisions. Chin highlighted that Maria had signed every financial document willingly, without coercion or deception. She had chosen to liquidate her inheritance, chosen to leave her career, and chosen to depend on Thomas's income rather than rebuilding her professional life. The attorney argued that Maria's current financial difficulties were entirely self-inflicted and that requiring Thomas to pay alimony would essentially be rewarding her irresponsibility. As the hearing continued, Maria noticed the same well-dressed woman from the previous week sitting in the gallery, still taking detailed notes. This time, the woman was accompanied by a younger man in an expensive suit who occasionally whispered in her ear while reviewing documents from a thick briefcase. Their presence felt significant somehow, though Maria couldn't understand why strangers would be so interested in her humiliating divorce proceedings. During a brief recess, Rodriguez pulled Maria aside again, his expression more urgent than before. He told her that his investigation had uncovered some irregularities that required immediate attention, something about her grandmother's estate that didn't match the information Thomas had provided during their marriage. His words were cryptic, but his tone suggested discovery of something significant that could change everything. Rodriguez mentioned that he had been contacted by investigators looking into certain financial matters related to her family background. He couldn't provide details yet, but promised that answers would be available soon. His mysterious comments reminded Maria again of Elena's final words about blood telling when the time was right, but she pushed away the hope that threatened to build in her chest. Disappointment had become too familiar to risk believing in miracles. When the hearing resumed, Judge Morrison announced that she would need additional time to review all financial documentation before making her decision. However, her comments suggested that she found Thomas's arguments compelling and Maria's situation largely self-inflicted. She scheduled a final hearing for the following week, during which she would render her decision on the alimony request. As they left the courthouse, Thomas approached Maria once again, his confidence even more pronounced than before. He told her that he hoped she would use this experience as motivation to finally take control of her life and develop some ambition. His words were delivered with fake concern that fooled no one, least of all Maria, who recognized the calculated cruelty behind his sympathetic expression. Margaret Chin joined them briefly, mentioning to Thomas that his alimony request was quite reasonable given the circumstances. She suggested that Maria should be grateful for the opportunity to develop financial responsibility, even if it came through court mandate rather than personal choice. Her comments were clearly intended for Maria to hear, adding insult to the injury of legal defeat. As Thomas and Chin walked away, discussing their post-hearing dinner plans at an upscale restaurant, Maria stood in the courthouse hallway feeling completely defeated. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The judge clearly sympathetic to Thomas's position, and her own attorney seemed to be grasping at mysterious straws that might not even exist. The prospect of paying $2,000 monthly to the man who had systematically destroyed her life felt like a final, crushing humiliation. But as she walked toward the exit, Maria noticed the well-dressed woman and her companion watching her with expressions that looked almost like recognition. When their eyes met, the woman smiled slightly and nodded toward Rodriguez, who was gathering his papers nearby. Something about the interaction suggested that forces were moving behind the scenes, investigations proceeding beyond Maria's knowledge or understanding. Elena's voice echoed in her memory once again, speaking about blood-telling and truth emerging when the time was right. For the first time since Thomas's betrayal had destroyed her life, Maria allowed herself to wonder if her grandmother's mysterious final words might actually mean something after all. David Rodriguez had never been particularly ambitious. At 43, he was content with his role as a public defender, helping people who couldn't afford expensive attorneys navigate the legal system's complexities. His small office in the King County Courthouse basement was cluttered with case files and powered by 3 different coffee makers, evidence of long nights spent preparing for impossible odds. But something about Maria Castellanos' case had ignited a spark of investigative passion he hadn't felt since law school. The discrepancies started small, barely noticeable inconsistencies in Thomas Whitmore's financial documentation that might have escaped a less thorough review. Rodriguez had requested copies of all joint account statements from the marriage, standard procedure for alimony cases. When the documents arrived, he noticed that several transactions were missing from Thomas's submitted evidence, gaps in the financial timeline that didn't make sense for someone as meticulous as a successful attorney. Rodriguez spent his weekend at the office, surrounded by bank statements and legal documents, cross-referencing dates and amounts with growing confusion. Thomas had submitted records showing his consistent financial support of Maria throughout their marriage, but the complete bank records told a different story. There were regular transfers from accounts that didn't appear on Thomas's financial disclosure, money flowing in directions that contradicted his testimony about their economic relationship. The first major discovery came when Rodriguez noticed that several large deposits to Thomas's business account were initiated using Maria's Social Security number. The transactions were automated, monthly transfers that had been occurring for years before Thomas and Maria even met. Rodriguez stared at the computer screen in his basement office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as he realized that Maria had been receiving income she apparently knew nothing about. Rodriguez called his friend Janet Liu, a private investigator who owed him several favors from cases where he had helped her clients avoid criminal charges. Janet's specialty was financial fraud investigation, and she had connections throughout the banking industry that could access records beyond normal legal channels. When Rodriguez explained the situation, Janet's interest was immediately piqued by the complexity of the financial manipulation. Janet's investigation revealed a web of deception so sophisticated that it required significant legal expertise to construct and maintain. Thomas had been intercepting Maria's mail for years, redirecting correspondence from banks and investment firms to a post office box he maintained under a slightly modified version of her name. Maria Elena Castellanos had been receiving monthly distributions from what appeared to be a family trust, money that had been automatically deposited into accounts she didn't know existed. The most shocking discovery came when Janet traced the source of the monthly deposits back to their origin. Maria Castellanos was listed as the primary beneficiary of the Elena Castellanos Family Trust, a substantial financial instrument that had been generating income for over a decade. The trust contained real estate holdings, stock portfolios, and other investments worth millions of dollars, all of which had been managed by a law firm in Colombia that had been trying to contact Maria for years. Rodriguez felt his hands shake as he reviewed the documentation Janet had uncovered. According to the trust documents, Maria's grandmother Elena had been far more than a humble seamstress who cleaned houses to support her family. Elena Castellanos had been a successful real estate investor in Colombia before immigrating to America, and she had continued building wealth through careful investments and property acquisitions throughout her life in the United States. The trust documents revealed that Elena had established the financial instrument specifically to provide for Maria's future, appointing herself as the initial trustee with instructions that control would pass to Maria upon Elena's death. The monthly distributions were designed to provide steady income while preserving the principal for Maria's long-term security. Elena had apparently tried to explain this arrangement to Maria multiple times, but her communications had been systematically intercepted by Thomas. Janet's investigation revealed the extent of Thomas's manipulation with devastating clarity. He had researched Maria's family background before they even met, using his legal connections to access public records about Elena's estate and the trust arrangements. His pursuit of Maria hadn't been romantic coincidence, but calculated financial predation, a long-term plan to gain control of wealth that Maria didn't even know she possessed. Rodriguez discovered that Thomas had been forging Maria's signature on financial documents for years, using his power of attorney privileges to redirect trust distributions to accounts under his control. The inheritance money from Elena's life insurance policy had been only a small fraction of Maria's actual wealth, a deliberate misdirection designed to make her believe she had received everything her grandmother had left behind. The investigation revealed that Thomas had been living a double life throughout their marriage, presenting himself as the primary breadwinner while secretly funding their lifestyle with Maria's own money. His law practice was moderately successful, but nowhere near profitable enough to support the expensive lifestyle he had convinced Maria they could afford together. The downtown condominium, the luxury cars, the weekend trips to expensive resorts had all been financed with money that belonged to Maria. Rodriguez called Maria at the diner where she was working her overnight shift, asking her to meet him at his office the next morning for an urgent discussion about her case. His voice carried an excitement that he tried to suppress, but Maria detected something significant in his tone that made her heart race with dangerous hope. She had learned to be suspicious of good news, but Rodriguez's discovery promised to change everything about her understanding of her own life. The meeting took place in Rodriguez's cluttered basement office, with Janet Liu present to explain the financial investigation results. Maria sat in a worn leather chair that squeaked every time she moved, listening to revelations that shattered everything she thought she knew about her grandmother, her marriage, and her own identity. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Janet spread out documents across Rodriguez's desk, each page representing another layer of deception. Maria's first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by anger that eclipsed anything she had felt during the divorce proceedings. Elena had tried to tell her about the trust on multiple occasions, conversations that Maria had dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman dealing with illness and medication. Elena's mysterious comments about blood telling and money being there when needed hadn't been mystical nonsense, but desperate attempts to communicate crucial information about Maria's financial inheritance. The documentation showed that the Elena Castellanos family trust was currently valued at approximately $47 million, a fortune that had been growing steadily throughout Maria's adult life while she struggled to pay for basic necessities. The trust owned residential and commercial properties throughout Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, managed by a reputable investment firm that had been trying to contact the beneficiary for years about important financial decisions. Rodriguez explained that Thomas's control over Maria's finances constituted multiple felonies, including identity theft, fraud, and forgery. His systematic interception of her mail and redirection of her income represented a criminal enterprise that had been operating for the entire duration of their relationship. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, supported by bank records, forged documents, and testimony from financial institutions that had been unwittingly participating in the deception. Maria learned that her current poverty was entirely artificial, maintained by Thomas's criminal manipulation of her financial resources. While she had been working minimum-wage jobs and sharing a studio apartment with a stranger, she was actually one of the wealthiest women in the Pacific Northwest. The irony was so devastating that Maria alternated between laughter and tears as Rodriguez explained the full scope of her hidden fortune. Janet's investigation had revealed that Thomas's alimony request was a desperate attempt to maintain his illegal access to Maria's money after their divorce. His lifestyle and business expenses far exceeded his legitimate income, and he had been counting on continued access to the trust distributions to maintain his financial facade. Without Maria's money, Thomas faced immediate bankruptcy and the exposure of his criminal activities. The most damaging evidence came from Thomas's own records, which showed his awareness of the trust arrangements and his systematic efforts to prevent Maria from discovering her inheritance. He had maintained detailed files about the trust's performance and had even communicated with the Colombian law firm about investment strategies, always representing himself as Maria's authorized financial representative. Rodriguez explained that they now had enough evidence to not only defeat the alimony request, but to pursue criminal charges against Thomas for his years of financial fraud. The case would likely result in Thomas's disbarment, criminal prosecution, and civil liability for damages that could exceed the value of his legitimate assets. Maria's transformation from poverty to wealth would be accompanied by Thomas's complete destruction. Maria asked about the timeline for accessing her actual inheritance, and Rodriguez explained that the legal process would require several weeks to complete. However, the trust's managing firm could provide immediate emergency distributions once Maria's identity was verified and Thomas's fraudulent control was terminated. Within days, she could have access to funds that would eliminate her financial struggles permanently. As the meeting concluded, Rodriguez warned Maria that Thomas would likely become desperate when he learned about the discovery of his fraud. Men like Thomas, who built their identities on manipulation and control, often became dangerous when their carefully constructed facades began crumbling. He recommended that Maria avoid contact with Thomas until legal proceedings could ensure her safety and financial protection. Maria left Rodriguez's office feeling dizzy from the magnitude of information she had received. The Elena Castellanos family trust represented not just financial security, but vindication of her grandmother's love and wisdom. Elena had spent her final years trying to communicate crucial information about Maria's future, information that Thomas had systematically prevented her from receiving. The guilt and regret Maria felt about dismissing Elena's attempts to explain the trust was overwhelming. The walk from the courthouse to the diner where Maria worked felt surreal, as if she was moving through a world that no longer applied to her circumstances. She was still wearing the same worn clothes and carrying the same empty purse, but everything about her identity and future had fundamentally changed. The financial struggles that had defined her existence for months were revealed as elaborate deceptions maintained by the man she had trusted with her life. That evening, Maria called in sick to her cleaning job and sat alone in the studio apartment she shared with Rosa, staring at photocopies of trust documents that proved her grandmother's incredible legacy. Elena's final words about blood-telling finally made perfect sense, a prophecy about truth emerging when the time was right and justice finally prevailing over deception. Meanwhile, across the city in his downtown condominium, Thomas Whitmore was beginning to panic. His private investigator had informed him that unusual inquiries were being made about Maria's background, questions that suggested someone was investigating financial matters that Thomas had kept hidden for years. The alimony case that was supposed to secure his continued access to Maria's money was suddenly threatening to expose the criminal enterprise that had funded his entire adult lifestyle. Thomas spent the night reviewing his options, but every scenario led to the same conclusion. His carefully constructed life was about to collapse with devastating consequences. The woman he had systematically robbed and manipulated was about to discover the truth about her inheritance, and his criminal activities were about to be exposed to law enforcement. The revenge that was coming would be swift, complete, and absolutely justified. The conference room at Rodriguez's law firm had never hosted a revelation quite like this one. Maria sat at the polished oak table, surrounded by bankers' boxes filled with evidence that would reshape her understanding of reality forever. Janet Liu had worked through the night with her team of forensic accountants, and the documentation spread across the table represented 8 years of systematic financial crime orchestrated by the man Maria had once loved. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated stacks of bank statements, forged documents, and correspondence that painted a picture of deception so comprehensive that Maria struggled to process its magnitude. Rodriguez sat across from her with Dr. Sandra Reeves, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in cases involving long-term psychological manipulation and financial abuse. The presence of a mental health expert underscored the severity of what Thomas had done to destroy Maria's sense of reality and self-worth. Janet Liu began with the timeline that had taken her team 3 days to reconstruct completely. The investigation revealed that Thomas Whitmore had first learned about Maria's inheritance approximately 9 months before they met. During his work on an unrelated estate case, that involved cross-referencing Colombian property records. His law firm had been hired to verify international assets for a different client, and during that research, he had discovered public records showing Elena Castellanos as the owner of substantial real estate holdings worth millions of dollars. The forensic reconstruction showed that Thomas had then systematically researched Maria's background, learning about her career at Hartwell Financial, her personal relationships, and her daily routines. He had discovered that Elena had been trying unsuccessfully to contact Maria about trust management decisions, correspondence that was being returned due to outdated address information. Thomas realized that Maria was completely unaware of her inheritance and had positioned himself to intercept communications about her financial legacy. Maria listened with growing horror as Janet explained how Thomas had engineered their first meeting at a coffee shop near her office building. Their supposedly chance encounter had been carefully planned, with Thomas studying her schedule for weeks to create the appearance of romantic coincidence. Every aspect of their early relationship had been calculated manipulation designed to gain her trust and eventual control over her finances. The documentation revealed the sophisticated legal mechanisms Thomas had used to gain unauthorized access to Maria's inheritance. Within 6 months of their marriage, he had forged power of attorney documents using his legal expertise to create paperwork that appeared legitimate to financial institutions. He had established mail forwarding services that redirected all correspondence about the trust to addresses under his control, ensuring that Maria would never receive information about her inheritance. Rodriguez presented bank records showing that Maria had been receiving monthly distributions of approximately $8,000 from the Elena Castellanos family trust for over a decade. The money had been automatically deposited into accounts that Thomas controlled, funds that had subsidized their lifestyle, while Maria believed she was financially dependent on his law practice income. The cruel irony was that Maria had been supporting Thomas entirely with her own money while he convinced her that she was a financial burden. The trust's complete financial statement revealed holdings that staggered everyone in the room. Elena Castellanos had built a real estate empire that included 47 residential properties in Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, along with 12 commercial buildings in prime downtown locations. The portfolio also contained diversified stock investments, government bonds, and cash reserves that had been carefully managed by professional investment firms for decades. Dr. Reeves explained the psychological impact of Thomas's systematic manipulation, helping Maria understand how his control had extended far beyond financial matters. He had used classic techniques of psychological abuse to convince Maria that she was incompetent, emotional, and incapable of managing adult responsibilities. His gradual isolation of her from professional contacts and family relationships had been designed to prevent her from discovering independent sources of information about her inheritance. The most devastating revelation came when Janet presented evidence that Thomas had been in communication with the Colombian law firm that managed Elena's original estate. He had represented himself as Maria's husband and financial representative, providing forged documentation to justify his authority over trust decisions. The law firm had been unknowingly facilitating Thomas's fraud for years, believing they were following the legitimate instructions of Elena's designated heir. Maria learned that her grandmother had spent the final years of her life desperately trying to communicate crucial information about the family trust. Elena's seemingly confused conversations about money and property had been lucid attempts to explain Maria's inheritance and the importance of maintaining contact with the trust's management firm. Thomas had systematically dismissed these conversations as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman, preventing Maria from understanding Elena's urgent messages. The investigation revealed that Elena had established the trust specifically to protect Maria's future after experiencing poverty during her own immigration to America. Elena's success in real estate investment had been driven by determination to ensure that her granddaughter would never face the financial insecurity that had defined Elena's early life in the United States. The trust had been designed to provide both immediate income and long-term wealth preservation for multiple generations of Maria's family. Rodriguez presented evidence showing that Thomas's law practice was barely profitable and certainly insufficient to support the lifestyle he had maintained throughout their marriage. His actual income averaged approximately $4,000 monthly after business expenses, while their household spending had consistently exceeded $10,000 monthly. The difference had been subsidized entirely by Maria's trust distributions, money that legally belonged to her, but had been systematically stolen through forged authorizations. The forensic accounting team had calculated that Thomas had stolen approximately $768,000 in direct trust distributions during their relationship, plus additional funds he had accessed through investment account manipulations. However, the civil damages extended far beyond the stolen money to include lost investment opportunities, emotional distress, and punitive damages that could exceed $10 million in total liability. Maria asked about the $47,000 inheritance from Elena's life insurance that she had contributed to Thomas's business investment. Janet's investigation revealed that this had been a deliberate misdirection designed to make Maria believe she had received her complete inheritance from Elena. The life insurance policy had been real, but it represented less than 1% of Elena's actual estate value. Thomas had used this small inheritance to maintain the illusion that Maria had no other family wealth, while he systematically stole millions from her trust. Dr. Reeves helped Maria understand that her feelings of confusion and self-doubt were normal responses to extended psychological manipulation. Thomas had used sophisticated gaslighting techniques to convince Maria that her memories were unreliable and her judgment was flawed. His treatment had been designed to make her dependent on his interpretation of reality, preventing her from questioning financial arrangements that should have seemed suspicious to someone with her professional background. The investigation had uncovered Thomas's detailed planning documents, including handwritten notes about strategies for maintaining control over Maria's finances after their marriage. He had researched legal precedents for spousal financial authority and had even consulted with other attorneys about methods for legitimizing access to inherited wealth through marriage. His predatory behavior had been systematic and premeditated, not impulsive decisions made during their relationship. Rodriguez explained that the Elena Castellanos family trust was currently valued at $47.3 million, making Maria one of the wealthiest individuals in the Pacific Northwest. The trust's diversified holdings had continued growing throughout the period of Thomas's manipulation, managed by professional investment firms who had been unaware of the fraudulent access to trust distributions. Maria's actual net worth exceeded the annual income of most Fortune 500 executives. Maria's emotional response to these revelations alternated between rage and overwhelming grief for the relationship with Elena that had been destroyed by Thomas's interference. Elena had died believing that Maria was ignoring her attempts to communicate important information about their family's financial legacy. The guilt and regret Maria felt about dismissing Elena's final conversations was compounded by realization that Thomas had deliberately prevented their meaningful connection during Elena's final months. The documentation revealed that Thomas's alimony request represented a desperate attempt to maintain his access to Maria's money after their divorce. His financial analysis had shown that losing access to the trust distributions would force him into immediate bankruptcy and expose his criminal activities to law enforcement investigation. The $2,000 monthly alimony demand was actually far less than the $8,000 he had been stealing monthly through trust manipulation. Janet presented evidence that Thomas had been preparing for the possibility of discovery by establishing offshore accounts and transferring assets to relatives and business associates. His panic about the alimony case stemmed from realization that legal scrutiny of their financial relationship would inevitably expose his fraud. He had been planning exit strategies while simultaneously demanding continued access to Maria's wealth through court-mandated alimony payments. Rodriguez explained the immediate legal implications of their discoveries. Thomas's activities constituted multiple federal and state felonies that would result in criminal prosecution, disbarment, and civil liability exceeding his ability to pay. The evidence was overwhelming and would likely result in a plea agreement rather than trial, with significant prison time as the most probable outcome. His legal career and personal reputation would be destroyed completely and permanently. Maria learned that she could access emergency funds from the trust immediately, while legal proceedings established her full control over the inheritance. The managing investment firm was prepared to provide whatever financial resources she needed to rebuild her life and pursue justice against Thomas. Her days of sharing studio apartments and working minimum-wage jobs were over forever, replaced by financial security that exceeded her previous understanding of wealth. The meeting concluded with Rodriguez explaining the timeline for legal action against Thomas. Criminal charges would be filed within days, followed by civil suits to recover stolen funds and additional damages. Thomas's assets would be frozen immediately to prevent him from hiding money or fleeing the jurisdiction. His carefully constructed life of luxury and professional success would collapse within weeks as Maria reclaimed her stolen inheritance. As Maria left the law firm that afternoon, she carried copies of documents that proved her grandmother's incredible legacy and Thomas's systematic betrayal. The revelation was too enormous to process completely, but one fact was clear. The power dynamic in her relationship with Thomas was about to reverse completely. The woman he had impoverished and humiliated was actually far wealthier than he could ever hope to become through legitimate means. Elena's final words about blood-telling finally made perfect sense as the ultimate prophecy about justice prevailing over deception. The inheritance Elena had built through decades of careful investment was about to destroy the man who had stolen it while providing Maria with resources for complete revenge. Thomas Whitmore had spent years systematically destroying Maria's life, and now she had the power to return the favor with interest. The courthouse was more crowded than usual for a routine alimony hearing, word having somehow spread about the unusual circumstances surrounding Maria Castellanos versus Thomas Whitmore. Legal observers, junior attorneys seeking education, and curious courthouse staff filled the gallery behind the main participants. Margaret Chun had arrived early, confident in her client's position and anticipating a swift victory that would establish precedent for similar cases involving financially irresponsible ex-wives. Thomas sat beside his attorney with the same composed confidence he had displayed throughout their previous hearings, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, and his expression conveying patient resignation about the unpleasant necessity of seeking court intervention for Maria's financial irresponsibility. He had spent the morning reviewing his victory speech, prepared to express hope that court-mandated alimony payments would finally motivate Maria to develop adult accountability and professional ambition. Maria entered the courtroom wearing the same navy dress she had worn to previous hearings, but something fundamental had changed in her posture and expression. She walked with her head high, no longer hunched in shame or defeat. David Rodriguez accompanied her, carrying a briefcase that seemed unusually heavy and a laptop computer that suggested technical presentations were planned for the hearing. Judge Morrison called the session to order and invited Margaret Chun to present any additional arguments supporting the alimony request. Chun rose confidently, reiterating Thomas's financial sacrifices during the marriage and Maria's continued pattern of avoiding professional responsibility. She emphasized that $2,000 monthly represented reasonable compensation for Thomas's years of supporting a wife who had contributed nothing to their household income. Rodriguez stood when Judge Morrison invited Maria's response, but instead of presenting arguments, he requested permission to present newly discovered evidence that was directly relevant to the financial circumstances under consideration. Judge Morrison granted permission, curious about evidence that had emerged so late in the proceedings. Rodriguez activated his laptop and connected it to the courtroom's projection system, explaining that his investigation had uncovered serious discrepancies in the financial information previously presented to the court. The first document he displayed was a bank statement showing monthly deposits of $8,000 to an account controlled by Thomas Whitmore, transactions that had been occurring for over 8 years. The courtroom murmured with confusion as Rodriguez explained that these deposits represented distributions from the Elena Castellanos family trust, funds that belonged legally to Maria but had been redirected to Thomas's control through forged authorization documents. Margaret Chun objected immediately, claiming the evidence was irrelevant to the alimony determination, but Judge Morrison ordered her to sit down and allow the presentation to continue. Rodriguez displayed a series of forged power of attorney documents bearing Maria's signature, followed by expert analysis proving that the signatures had been created through sophisticated forgery techniques. The forensic evidence showed that Thomas had been systematically stealing Maria's inheritance throughout their marriage while convincing her that she was financially dependent on his income. The projection screen filled with the complete financial statement for the Elena Castellanos family trust, showing assets valued at $47.3 million distributed across real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and cash reserves. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers as Rodriguez explained that Maria was not the impoverished, irresponsible woman Thomas had portrayed, but actually one of the wealthiest individuals in the Pacific Northwest. Thomas's face went completely pale as he realized the scope of evidence Rodriguez was presenting. His hands began trembling visibly as bank records appeared on the screen, showing that his law practice income averaged less than $50,000 annually, while his lifestyle expenses exceeded $120,000 yearly. The difference had been subsidized entirely by Maria's stolen trust distributions. Margaret Chun demanded a recess to review the new evidence, but Judge Morrison denied the request and ordered Rodriguez to continue his presentation. The next series of documents showed Thomas's detailed research into Maria's family background, including handwritten notes about strategies for accessing her inheritance through marriage. His predatory targeting of Maria was revealed as systematic financial crime rather than romantic coincidence. Rodriguez presented email correspondence between Thomas and the Colombian law firm managing Elena's estate, communications showing that Thomas had represented himself as Maria's authorized financial representative for years. The law firm had been unknowingly facilitating Thomas's fraud, believing they were following legitimate instructions from Elena's designated heir. The projection screen displayed a timeline showing that Thomas had intercepted Maria's mail for 8 years, redirecting all communications about the trust to addresses under his control. Evidence showed that Maria had never received a single document informing her about her inheritance, while Thomas had been receiving detailed quarterly reports about the trust's performance and investment strategies. Judge Morrison interrupted Rodriguez to ask Maria directly whether she had been aware of the family trust or the monthly distributions. Maria stood and testified that she had known nothing about either the trust or the income it generated, having been told by Thomas that her grandmother's life insurance policy represented her complete inheritance from Elena's estate. Thomas finally spoke, attempting to claim that he had been protecting Maria from financial responsibilities she was emotionally unprepared to handle. His explanation sounded desperate and unconvincing as Rodriguez presented evidence showing that Thomas had been living entirely on Maria's money while convincing her that she was a financial burden who contributed nothing to their household income. Margaret Chun made a final attempt to salvage her client's position by arguing that marriage created joint financial responsibilities regardless of the money's original source. Rodriguez responded by presenting evidence that Thomas's control over Maria's finances constituted identity theft, fraud, and forgery under federal and state law. The Alimony case had evolved into a criminal matter that required immediate law enforcement intervention. Judge Morrison reviewed the complete evidence in stunned silence before addressing Thomas directly. She asked whether he had anything to say about the allegations of systematic financial fraud documented in Rodriguez's presentation. Thomas's response was barely audible as he claimed that his actions had been motivated by love and concern for Maria's well-being. The judge then addressed the original alimony request with barely contained anger. She noted that Thomas was seeking financial support from a woman whose money he had been stealing for 8 years while convincing her that she was poor and dependent on his generosity. The request represented not just legal frivolity, but criminal audacity that demonstrated complete disrespect for the court and the legal system. Judge Morrison dismissed the alimony case immediately and ordered Thomas's assets frozen pending criminal investigation. She directed Rodriguez to provide all evidence to the district attorney's office for prosecution and warned Thomas that he was likely facing federal charges for mail fraud, identity theft, and interstate financial crimes. The courtroom erupted as observers realized they had witnessed the complete exposure of one of the most sophisticated financial fraud cases in recent memory. Thomas sat motionless as the implications of his exposure settled over him like a suffocating blanket. His legal career, personal reputation, and financial security had been destroyed in less than 30 minutes of devastating evidence presentation. Margaret Chin gathered her papers and left the courtroom without speaking to Thomas, recognizing that professional association with him would damage her own reputation. Thomas was left alone at the defendant's table, facing the complete destruction of everything he had built through 8 years of systematic crime. As the hearing concluded, Maria approached Thomas with Rodriguez beside her for protection. She looked directly at the man who had stolen years of her life and millions of dollars from her inheritance. She told him quietly that he would be hearing from her attorneys about civil damages that would exceed his ability to pay, and that his theft of her grandmother's legacy would be punished with the full force of both criminal and civil law. Thomas could only stare at her in shocked recognition that the woman he had impoverished and controlled was actually wealthy enough to destroy him completely. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship had reversed so dramatically that he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his miscalculation. Maria walked out of the courthouse as a millionaire seeking justice rather than an impoverished woman begging for mercy. The legal proceedings that followed would complete Thomas's destruction while restoring her rightful control over Elena's incredible legacy. The courthouse steps had witnessed countless moments of legal victory and defeat, but few as dramatic as the scene that unfolded as Thomas Whitmore emerged from his devastating hearing. 2 federal agents waited beside a black sedan, their presence coordinated with Rodriguez's evidence presentation to ensure Thomas couldn't flee or destroy additional evidence. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists as courthouse observers and local media captured his arrest for fraud, identity theft, and interstate financial crimes. Maria watched from the courthouse entrance as the man who had controlled and impoverished her for 8 years was led away in custody. The reversal was so complete that she struggled to process the emotional impact of seeing Thomas reduced from confident manipulator to desperate criminal facing decades in federal prison. Rodriguez stood beside her, explaining that the charges would likely result in plea negotiations rather than trial, given the overwhelming evidence of Thomas's systematic fraud. Within hours of Thomas's arrest, Maria's first decision as a wealthy woman was to hire the most expensive and ruthless attorneys money could buy, not for her own protection, but to ensure Thomas faced maximum consequences for his crimes. She retained the services of Morrison, Blake & Associates, a prestigious firm specializing in complex financial fraud prosecution that charged $1,500 hourly for their expertise in destroying white-collar criminals. The law firm's senior partner, Victoria Morrison, reviewed the evidence against Thomas with barely concealed excitement. She explained to Maria that the case represented career-defining prosecution opportunity, with evidence so comprehensive that Thomas's conviction was virtually guaranteed. The firm would coordinate with federal prosecutors to ensure Thomas received maximum sentencing under federal guidelines for financial fraud and identity theft. Thomas's legal troubles multiplied exponentially as various law enforcement agencies launched investigations into his criminal activities. The State Bar Association initiated disbarment proceedings based on his conviction for fraud and forgery. The Internal Revenue Service opened an audit investigating his failure to report Maria's stolen money as taxable income. His law practice faced civil lawsuits from clients whose cases had been compromised by his criminal activities. Margaret Chin publicly distanced herself and her firm from Thomas's case, issuing statements emphasizing that they had been deceived about the true circumstances of his financial situation. Her reputation survived, but barely, and she faced professional scrutiny for failing to detect obvious signs of her client's criminal behavior during their representation. The investigation into Thomas's finances revealed the complete scope of his fraudulent lifestyle. His downtown condominium, BMW, expensive suits, and luxury vacations had all been financed with Maria's stolen money while she worked minimum-wage jobs and shared studio apartments. The assets were seized immediately to satisfy criminal forfeiture requirements and civil judgment obligations that would exceed his ability to pay. Thomas's arraignment took place in federal court, where he faced charges carrying potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. His court-appointed attorney advised him that plea negotiations represented his only realistic option, given the overwhelming evidence and Maria's unlimited resources for pursuing maximum prosecution. The man who had once commanded expensive legal representation was reduced to relying on overworked public defenders. Maria used her restored wealth to hire private investigators who uncovered additional evidence of Thomas's criminal activities extending beyond their marriage. The investigation revealed that he had attempted similar financial manipulation with previous relationships, though none as successful as his systematic theft of Maria's inheritance. Additional victims came forward, expanding the scope of criminal charges and civil liability he faced. The psychological impact of his exposure and arrest devastated Thomas more completely than the legal consequences. His identity had been built on manipulation and control, and his complete powerlessness in the face of Maria's wealth and determination destroyed his sense of self. The confident attorney who had demanded alimony payments was reduced to a broken man, facing the reality of decades in federal prison. Rodriguez worked with Maria to understand the emotional impact of her years under Thomas's psychological manipulation. She realized that her supposed laziness and depression during their marriage had actually been unconscious grief for the lost connection with Elena's legacy. Thomas's systematic isolation had prevented her from understanding Elena's final attempts to communicate about the family trust, creating guilt and confusion that had manifested as the emotional symptoms Thomas used to justify his control. Elena's wisdom about blood-telling finally made complete sense as Maria understood her grandmother's prediction about truth emerging when justice demanded revelation. Elena had somehow known that Thomas's deception couldn't be maintained forever and that Maria's inheritance would eventually surface to destroy those who had stolen it. The family fortune had indeed told its own story when the time was right. Maria's first major decision as a wealthy woman was to establish the Elena Castellanos Foundation, dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud and psychological abuse. The foundation provided legal resources, counseling services, and financial support for people who had experienced manipulation similar to Thomas's systematic theft. Maria's personal experience with fraud made her uniquely qualified to help others recover from similar crimes. Thomas's plea negotiations revealed the full extent of his financial desperation. His legitimate assets totaled less than $40,000 after business debts and legal obligations were satisfied. The stolen money he had spent on his fraudulent lifestyle exceeded $700,000, while civil damages for emotional distress, lost investment opportunities, and punitive awards totaled over $8 million. He would spend the rest of his life financially destroyed by his crimes against Maria. The final plea agreement resulted in Thomas receiving a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, followed by supervised probation and restitution requirements he could never fulfill. His law license was permanently revoked, making him unemployable in any profession requiring trust or financial responsibility. The man who had once lived in luxury was reduced to poverty more severe than anything Maria had experienced during his manipulation. 6 months after Thomas's sentencing, Maria received a letter from him in federal prison. The correspondence was a desperate plea for financial assistance, claiming that his family was suffering because of his incarceration and asking for help with basic necessities. The irony was perfect. Thomas was now genuinely requesting the same financial support he had fraudulently demanded through his alimony case. Maria's response was swift and final. She informed Thomas through her attorneys that he would receive no assistance of any kind, and that any further attempts at communication would be reported to prison authorities as harassment. The man who had stolen her grandmother's legacy while claiming she owed him financial support would face his consequences alone and without mercy. 2 years after the courthouse revelation, Maria had transformed her life completely while ensuring Thomas's destruction remained permanent. She lived comfortably but not ostentatiously, using her wealth primarily for charitable purposes and helping other fraud victims navigate legal recovery. Her grandmother's legacy had become a force for justice rather than personal luxury, exactly as Elena would have wanted. Thomas remained in federal prison, working in the laundry facility for 20 cents hourly, while serving his sentence for stealing millions from the woman he had systematically impoverished and controlled. His fellow inmates showed him no respect when they learned about his crimes against his own wife, and his remaining years would be spent in the poverty and powerlessness he had artificially imposed on Maria. The Elena Castellanos family trust continued growing under Maria's careful stewardship, managed by professional investment firms who ensured that Elena's legacy would benefit future generations. Maria had learned to honor her grandmother's wisdom while using Elena's wealth to pursue justice for those who had been victimized by predators like Thomas. Looking back on the courthouse revelation that had changed everything, Maria understood that Elena's final words about blood-telling had been both prophecy and promise. The truth about family, money, and justice had indeed emerged when the time was right, destroying those who had stolen from the innocent and restoring power to those who deserved it. This story of hidden fortunes and devastating revenge really makes you think about how the people closest to us might not be who they seem to be. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone you trusted completely turned out to be manipulating you? Or do you know someone who discovered shocking truths about their past? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how this story resonated with you, and whether you think Maria's complete destruction of Thomas was justified given what he had stolen from her.